high above the clouds, in a cabin designed for comfort and status. The air carried more than the hum of engines. It held a quiet game, one built from precision, not chance. Every gesture, every perfectly timed inconvenience, struck with a kind of accuracy that could ruin a reputation without leaving a single visible mark. Around them, passengers sipped wine and adjusted pillows, unaware they were sharing the sky with a slow-brewing war. By the time the truth surfaced, the roles of hunter and prey would no longer be the same. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment on where you're watching from so you're here when the full story unfolds. The cabin hums with practiced opulence, a hush engineered by dim sconces, leather that drinks the light, and the discreet orchestra of wheels, zippers, and muffled footsteps. Adria Holloway enters this curated stillness with the composed cadence of a frequent traveler who refuses to apologize for her presence. Her carry-on rolls in precise alignment with the aisle, its polished corners reflecting a clean arc of gold along the beveled edge of a seat shell. She registers row numbers with the exactness of someone who has learned to read spaces before they read her, fingertips firm on the handle while the aircraft breathes cold, conditioned air across her collarbone. Up ahead, Clarice Von holds the doorway of the cabin like a portrait of control. Uniform seems straight as rails, bun immaculate. Surfaces gleaming where starch has hardened pleats into intent. Her attention grazes across passengers in quick economical assessments. The blush of a honeymoon duo, the watch-face glint of a retired executive, the sleepy blink of a teenager clutching noise-canceling headphones, and then lands on Adria, lingers for one fractional beat longer than courtesy allows, and lifts in that slight, silent arch that relegates a person to a category. No greeting follows, only withdrawal, a pivot of the jawline, and a return to the choreography of everyone else. Adria neither hesitates nor hurries. At her row she stops, pivots shoulder to aisle, and raises the carry-on with the habitual, measured motion of someone who has spent years mastering the unremarkable act of fitting into compartments. The hinge gives its soft, rubber-muted complaint. The bin inhales light. Before the wheels settle into place, Clarice arrives without the flourish of service, only the sufficiency of decision. Palms slide against the handle, and the bag is nudged to the far corner with a small, proprietary insistence that makes room not for safety or geometry, but for an unspoken hierarchy. The center of the bin remains open as a held breath, notched with invitation for a future arrival deemed worthier of the prime slot. Clarice recedes, smile reconstituted for another row, voice pitched to that buoyant register that says welcome while selecting who receives it. Adria lowers into her seat by the window, spine long, shoulders quiet, eyes steady on the laminar flow of activity around her. Outside, the apron bakes under mid-afternoon sun, and the silhouettes of ground crew slide like dark fish through luminous shallows. Inside, first class assembles its tableau, a linen triangle smoothed over a tray, a magazine squared to armrest edge, a flute of something pale catching a tremor of light and holding it like a secret. A faint scent of citrus hand gel lingers after Clarice's passage. A hint of jet fuel laces the conditioned air with something metallic and real. The seat cradles Adria's frame in engineered kindness, but the memory of that eyebrow and the displaced bag marks the upholstery with an invisible seam. Subtlety becomes the chosen weapon. Clarice patrols the lane with the unwavering posture of someone who trusts procedures more than people. She adjusts a garment bag here, eases a roller bag there, always with gloved precision. Passengers receive micro-affirmations, the little nods and murmurs that tell them they belong. Adria watches, not with hunger or hurt, but with a clinical attention sharpened by repetition. A map draws itself, whose blanket arrives folded like a gift, whose water is placed with care, whose proximity earns warmth, whose presence elicits efficiency and nothing more. The pageant continues. A couple across the aisle receives a practiced sparkle of eye contact. A travel-weary consultant gets a reassuring touch at the shoulder. An older gentleman's joke earns a careful, contained laugh. When Clarice turns again toward Adria's bin, she does not glance downward. She slides a new arrival's leather duffel into the prime space left open earlier. The motion smooth as ballet, the straps aligned to the edge, the gesture signed with a micro-adjustment that feels like a keystone settling into an arch. The signal lands without a sound. Clarice Vaughn glided down the aisle with a tray of neatly folded, steaming hot towels. Her heels clicked against the carpet in a rhythm that matched her deliberate pace. The warmth from the towels rose in thin tendrils of scented steam, drifting like an invitation of comfort. Yet as she approached Audria's row, Clarice's eyes flicked briefly toward her, just long enough to register her presence, before shifting away, her smile sharpening for the man seated directly behind her. The tray passed by as if Audria were invisible, the gap between Clarice's extended arm and Audria's reach just wide enough to make clear this was no oversight. The passenger behind Audria accepted the towel with a thank you, completely unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the omission. Audria's gaze followed Clarice for a moment, not with pleading, but with the calm acknowledgement of someone who had seen such selective courtesy before. The slight was small, but in first class, where every passenger was meant to be treated with meticulous equality. Its meaning was sharp. Audria returned her attention to the book open in her lap, though the words seemed to blur for a moment under the weight of the insult. Clarice continued down the aisle, her practiced efficiency untouched, her demeanor bright for everyone else. Minutes later, she reappeared, this time with a tray of water glasses. The crystal shimmered faintly in the cabin's soft lighting, each glass filled to the brim. She moved with precision until she reached Audria's seat. Without slowing, Clarice placed a glass on Audria's tray table. The movement was brisk, mechanical, yet the base of the glass struck with just enough force that the water tipped forward in a thin wave, splashing over the rim and onto Audria's napkin and the edge of her dress. The sound was slight, barely enough to draw attention from anyone nearby, but the wet fabric clung immediately to Audria's knee. Clarice didn't pause to offer an apology, didn't reach for a fresh napkin. Her hand was already on the next glass, her attention on the man across the aisle as though nothing had happened. Audria set her book down and dabbed at the spill with the corner of her napkin, her movements slow, measured, refusing to show agitation. The white linen absorbed the water quickly, but the chill seeped through the fabric. Her eyes lifted once toward Clarice's retreating figure, cataloging the slight as one might mark an item in a ledger, an incident noted, to be revisited later. Around her, the cabin's curated serenity continued. A couple near the front exchanged quiet laughter. The attendant in the opposite aisle refilled champagne flutes for a pair of business travelers. Somewhere toward the rear, a baby let out a brief cry before being soothed. Clarice emerged from the galley with a polished metal cart, the kind reserved for the elaborate presentation of the first-class dining experience. Steam rose from covered porcelain dishes, the scent of rosemary and butter intermingled with that of freshly baked rolls. Each plate was placed before passengers with a practiced elegance, cover lifted with a graceful flourish, a brief description of the entree offered, as though it were an exclusive secret. For the man across the aisle, there was seared halibut with a saffron cream sauce. For the couple ahead, filet mignon with seasonal vegetables. Every movement was deliberate, a performance designed to make each recipient feel singular and valued. Then Clarice reached Audria's row. Her expression didn't shift, but the rhythm of her hands changed. Instead of a porcelain plate, she placed a small, plastic-sealed tray onto Audria's table, a light snack of crackers, a cube of cheddar, and a handful of grapes. No description, no flourish, not even the faintest nod. The tray made a muted thud as it touched the table, and Clarice was already leaning toward the passenger behind Audria, unveiling a dish of pasta crowned with shaved truffles. Audria glanced at the plastic tray, its contents arranged with all the charm of a vending machine purchase, and then at the gleaming china being set down just an arm's length away. The difference was stark, deliberate, and impossible to mistake for an oversight. She did not touch the snack, letting it sit on the table as though it were a specimen to be examined later. The warmth of the surrounding plates seemed to amplify the chill in her own service. Clarice's performance continued seamlessly, her tone warm for others, her hands steady as she poured wine into crystal glasses, the deep red liquid catching the cabin light like molten garnet. Adria's glass remained empty. She closed her book, placed it neatly beside the untouched snack, and let her gaze drift toward the window, though her peripheral vision tracked every motion in the aisle. Minutes later, another attendant emerged from the opposite galley with a stack of neatly folded, pale cream blankets. They were soft, with the faint sheen of high-thread count cotton, rolled into tight bundles secured with a ribbon. The attendant began distributing them row by row, a small gesture of comfort in the cool cabin air. On the left side of the aisle, each passenger accepted their blanket with quiet gratitude, unrolling them to drape across their laps. Across from Adria, a man adjusted his seat into a recline, blanket pulled snugly over him, the fabric pulling slightly at his waist. Clarice reappeared to assist, adjusting the corner for him with a smile. She moved on, ensuring each passenger had theirs, her steps precise, her demeanor unfaltering. When she reached Adria's seat, her pace didn't falter, but her hands remained empty. She passed by without pause, without even a glance, her focus already on a passenger 2 rows down who wanted an extra pillow. The absence was subtle enough to escape notice from others, but to Adria it was as sharp as a closed door. The temperature in the cabin was cool enough that the lack of a blanket was felt almost immediately. She shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as if the decision not to offer her the same comfort had no effect. Inside, however, she catalogued the moment alongside the missing towel, the spilled water, the downgraded meal. Each was a stroke on the same canvas, painting an image of calculated exclusion. The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft passed through a mild patch of turbulence. Passengers adjusted their seats and cups, some clutching their blankets tighter. Adria kept her posture steady, her expression neutral. She understood that each slight was designed to provoke a reaction, to elicit some sign of discomfort or complaint that could be dismissed or turned against her. She would give none. Clarice passed by once more, checking trays, ensuring the warm plates were cleared only after passengers had finished. When she reached Adria's table, she made no comment on the untouched snack, simply removed it with the same efficiency she had used to place it there. The plate was gone in seconds, replaced by nothing. Adria's tray table now sat bare, its smooth surface empty under the soft light, as if she had never been served at all. Around her, the scent of coffee began to circulate as dessert service began. She knew she would not be offered any. That was fine. The ledger in her mind had grown another 2 entries. The downgraded snack, the absent blanket, each previous slight remained fresh, each meticulously stored without visible emotion. Clarice, on the other hand, moved through the aisle with the same controlled efficiency as before, her every step carrying the authority of someone who understood the invisible rules of a space like this, and how to bend them to her own ends. From the forward galley, Clarice emerged with a slow, deliberate motion, her hands brushing over the thick fabric of the privacy curtain that separated the front galley from the passenger cabin. She glanced toward Adria, not with open hostility, but with a detached calculation of someone rearranging her room to suit her needs. Then, in one measured sweep, she drew the curtain across the aisle so that it closed just beyond Adria's row. The metal hooks slid along the track with a faint metallic scrape, ending in a muffled click as the fabric settled into place. The result was immediate. The broad view of the cabin, its open space, the sight of attendants preparing meals or offering drinks at the front, was now cut off from Adria. From her seat, she could see only the narrow section of aisle directly ahead and to the side, as though her place in the cabin had been visually diminished. The movement was subtle enough that it could have been explained away as a simple adjustment, yet it was executed with such precision and timing that it left little doubt of its intent. Adria did not lean forward or attempt to peer around it. She simply adjusted her posture, resting her arm against the window side armrest, her gaze steady. If the goal had been to make her feel isolated, Clarice would not see the satisfaction of a reaction. The curtain hung as an artificial horizon, severing her connection to the front of the cabin where other passengers were still visible to one another. It was a gesture of exclusion, dressed in the neutral garb of cabin management. Minutes passed. The attendants continued their work beyond the curtain, the muted sounds of clinking glasses and low conversation carrying through the heavy fabric. Then Clarice returned, this time with her attention fixed on the overhead bins. She opened them one by one, checking the arrangement of bags as though ensuring everything complied with safety standards. Her hands moved with a quiet decisiveness as she reached Audria's row. She unlocked the latch above, lifting the door with a smooth upward motion, and peered inside. Her gaze landed on a smaller leather satchel that Audria had placed there earlier, positioned neatly beside her carry-on. Clarice reached for it without a word, the action fluid, but marked with ownership, as though the bag's current position were somehow unacceptable. She carried it down the aisle, the strap looped over her arm, her steps unhurried yet unwavering. Audria watched her go, tracking the movement until Clarice stopped near the end of the cabin, past the section reserved for first class, and tucked the bag into an open space above the lower class seating. The compartment closed with a firm snap. Clarice did not glance back as she retraced her steps, pausing to exchange a pleasant word with another passenger before continuing toward the galley. The relocation of the bag had no practical necessity. There had been ample space above Audria's seat. It was another small but deliberate act of control, one meant to diminish convenience and assert authority over her space. For a frequent traveler, having personal items close at hand was part of the comfort purchased with a first-class ticket, and removing that access was yet another notch in the pattern of targeted treatment. Audria's gaze shifted briefly toward the curtain, then back to the closed bin above her now conspicuously emptier seat. The absence of the bag was almost more noticeable than its presence had been, a quiet reminder that even her storage space was not immune to alteration. She considered asking for its return, but dismissed the thought immediately. Confrontation, especially in this environment, would hand Clarice the very display she seemed to be fishing for, a visible sign of frustration to be framed as overreaction. Instead, Audria adjusted the seat slightly, pressing the recline button until she felt the mechanism hum beneath her, lowering her into a position of comfort that was entirely her own choice. The curtain remained closed, the space above her seat partially hollow, yet she allowed her focus to drift toward the steady vibration of the aircraft, the soft reflection of clouds in the double-pane glass. She could hear Clarice speaking to someone near the galley, her voice warm, modulated, carrying the cadence of good service. The sound faded as Clarice moved farther forward, then reappeared faintly when she returned to the aisle, resuming her silent survey of the cabin. Every act was calculated, wrapped in the plausible deniability of standard procedure, but Audria's mental record of events was growing longer and more cohesive. The withheld towel, the spill, the downgraded meal, the absent blanket, the block view, and now the removal of her personal bag, all threads weaving into the same fabric. Outside, the sunlight slanted lower, bathing the wing in amber. Inside, the shadows stretched slightly, deepening the contrast between the warm light near the windows and the cooler, dimmer glow beneath the overhead panels. Passengers settled into their mid-flight routines, some reclining with eyes closed, others tapping away at laptops or watching silent films. Audria's stillness blended into the calm, but beneath it, a resolve was solidifying. She could endure the game Clarice was playing, but she also knew endurance was not her only option. There would be a time and place to address this, not with raised voices or emotional outbursts, but with a kind of precision that left no space for denial. The curtain still hung across Audria's view, the air beyond it humming with activity she was deliberately cut off from. Her smaller bag remained tucked away at the far end of the aircraft out of reach, and though she gave no outward sign, the absence was as tangible as the curtain itself. She sat upright, the soft leather of the seat cool beneath her, her hands folded loosely, her gaze on the clouds sliding past the window. From the forward section, Clarice emerged once again, her posture straight, clipboard in hand, beginning her slow progression down the aisle to perform the routine safety check. The seatbelt check was a standard procedure, mechanical and quick, yet when she reached Audria's row, her manner shifted almost imperceptibly. She leaned down closer than necessary, her presence intruding into Audria's space, her perfume sharp in the cooled air. Clarice's eyes flicked to the buckle across Adria's lap. It was fastened correctly, neat and secure, but she lingered, staring at it as if it were somehow wrong. Then she shook her head slowly, theatrically, a movement meant not for Adria's benefit, but for the small audience of passengers in the rows nearby. A long, exaggerated sigh escaped her, heavy enough to carry over the ambient noise of the engines. The sound drew a glance or two from across the aisle, subtle but effective, planting the seed of suggestion that something about Adria's compliance was inadequate. Clarice straightened without a word and moved to the next seat, her expression reset to its pleasant neutrality. Adria's eyes followed her briefly, registering every calculated beat of the performance, before returning to the quiet landscape beyond the glass. A few minutes later, Clarice returned without the clipboard, now carrying a small stack of in-flight reading materials. She moved briskly between seats, replacing worn magazines with fresh ones, adjusting their placement on tray tables to match the airline's exacting presentation standards. At Adria's row, she paused just long enough to reach into her stack and pull out a magazine that was visibly creased down the center, its cover curling at the edges, a corner torn near the bottom. Without breaking her rhythm, Clarice set the battered magazine squarely on Adria's tray table, her fingertips pressing it flat as though it were perfectly acceptable. She didn't bother to align it with the edge of the table as she had for others. It lay there askew, the rip in its cover catching the cabin light. Then she was gone again, moving to the next passenger and laying down pristine issues, each one glossy and without flaw. Adria looked at the torn magazine without touching it. The damage was small, but in this environment, where presentation and polish were part of the product, it was as conspicuous as a stain on white linen. She could feel the deliberate nature of it, the decision to select this particular magazine for her seat alone. It wasn't about the reading material, it was about the message. The curtain blocked her forward view. Her bag was elsewhere, and now even the small token of the reading material had been used as another vehicle for diminishing her. Around her, other passengers seemed to drift deeper into their comfort. A man across the aisle unfolded his newspaper without looking in her direction. The couple ahead adjusted their reclined seats to a more comfortable angle. The hum of the engines remained steady, the occasional clink of cutlery from the galley filtering through the curtain. Adria kept her expression composed, her breathing even. The torn magazine stayed on her tray table, untouched, a silent testament to the pettiness she was enduring. Clarice passed by again, her eyes flicking briefly toward the tray, no doubt noting that Adria hadn't moved it or hidden the flaw. Perhaps she had expected the magazine to be tucked away or pushed aside, some sign of discomfort she could file away as a victory. Instead, it remained exactly where she had placed it, its imperfections fully exposed. Clarice adjusted a pillow for a passenger in the next row and moved on, but there was the faintest stiffness in her posture as she disappeared toward the galley. Adria's mind, meanwhile, remained clear and precise. She was no stranger to such games, the way they sought to provoke and unsettle without ever stepping far enough to be called out directly. But she also knew that such actions, repeated and documented mentally, built their own case over time. She wasn't collecting these moments out of resentment alone. She was collecting them because they were evidence, and evidence was power in the right hands. As the light in the cabin shifted again, deepening toward evening, the torn magazine still sat between her and the aisle. The curtain ahead remained drawn tight, the section beyond humming faintly with activity she was not permitted to witness, her smaller bag still exiled to the end of the aircraft, and the space above her head conspicuously empty. The sigh during the seatbelt check, the dismissive shake of the head, the downgraded meal, the absent blanket, all of it now formed a steady drumbeat in her awareness, each act subtle enough to be deniable, yet sharp enough to pierce. Adria's composure held firm, her body language calm, though every movement of Clarice in the aisle registered in her periphery like a needle's prick. It was mid-flight now, the quiet window where time seemed to stretch and passengers settled deeper into their chosen comforts. Adria had finally been served a late lunch, identical in presentation to those of her neighbors this time, though the aroma suggested the dish had been reheated rather than freshly plated. She ate methodically, savoring only enough to maintain her appetite for the hours ahead, her fork pausing occasionally as she glanced toward the window to watch the slow drift of cloud cover. The clink of silverware on porcelain was muffled by the soft murmur of conversations around her, the low hiss of the air vents, the muted shuffle of attendants moving carts in the galley. She was mid-bite when Clarice reappeared, moving down the aisle with the brisk precision of someone executing a timed drill. Without so much as a word, Clarice's hands reached for Adria's tray, her fingers curling around its edges. The plate still held more than half its food, a piece of bread untouched, the small dessert not yet disturbed. The fork was still in Adria's hand, paused above the plate, but Clarice did not wait for permission. The tray was lifted away in one smooth, unbroken motion, the fork nearly slipping from Adria's grip before she set it down with deliberate care. The faint scrape of china on metal as the dishes shifted was the only sound between them before Clarice turned and continued down the aisle, clearing trays from others who had already finished. The absence of acknowledgement was complete. Adria's gaze followed her only briefly before shifting to the empty space on her table, the torn magazine still present, but now joined by the absence of the meal she had not finished. The message was clear. Her comfort and schedule could be overridden at will. She adjusted her posture, took a slow sip of water, and allowed the quiet around her to refill the space where the tray had been. Time passed, the minutes marked by the deepening shadows outside and the faint shift in cabin lighting to a warmer hue meant to suggest the approach of evening. Adria rested back in her seat, letting the headrest cradle her, her eyes slipping shut for a brief respite. The engine's constant vibration and the warmth of the cabin air began to lull her into a light doze, her mind settling just enough to detach from the undercurrent of tension. Then, without warning, pressure against the back of her seat jolted her forward. The headrest moved abruptly as the seat back was pushed into its fully upright position. The motion was sudden enough that her hands instinctively gripped the armrests, her shoulders tightening against the unexpected shift. When her eyes opened, Clarice was already moving past her, her hands adjusting the seat back of the passenger across the aisle, offering a polite nod there that she had withheld from Adria. No explanation was given for the adjustment, no indication that it was necessary for service or safety. It was simply done, as though her own comfort was irrelevant. The abruptness lingered in her muscles, the jolt settling into the space between her shoulder blades. She exhaled slowly, easing herself back into the enforced upright posture, her hands smoothing the fabric of her blazer as she reclaimed control of her physical presence. Clarice continued down the aisle, checking headrests and trays, her movements efficient but tinged with that same selective precision that had marked every interaction with Adria since the start of the flight. Adria's eyes remained open now, her attention sharpened again. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' contentment pressing in from all sides, the reclined seats, the blankets draped across laps, the uninterrupted meals, and her own experience stood out in sharper relief against that background. Every minor disruption had been timed to chip away at her ease, to insert inconvenience into moments meant for rest. The torn magazine, still sitting where it had been placed, now seemed almost symbolic, a placeholder for every small act of control Clarice had exercised. She reached out not to move it, but to tap its edge once with the tip of her finger, the gesture as much a reaffirmation to herself as it was an acknowledgement of its meaning. The engine's steady hum filled the silence, punctuated only by the faint murmur of a movie playing on a nearby screen and the soft rustle of a page being turned across the aisle. Clarice had moved on, perhaps satisfied with the disruption, perhaps already calculating the next one. Adria's posture remained upright, not out of submission, but because she refused to adjust it on Clarice's terms. She was still in control of her response, even if she could not control the provocations. The light outside had shifted to a softer gold, the sky streaked with thin veils of cirrus cloud. The cabin lighting matched it, casting warm highlights on the polished wood veneer of the seat shells and the brushed metal accents. It was an atmosphere designed for comfort, for unwinding before arrival. And yet for Adria, it remained laced with the constant awareness of being targeted in ways too small to call out, but too frequent to ignore. She reached for her water glass again, holding it steady as she drank, her gaze fixed ahead on the closed curtain. The fabric swayed slightly with the motion of the plane, its movement almost hypnotic, a subtle reminder of the boundary Clarice had imposed earlier. She let her eyes linger on it for a long moment before turning back to the window. The horizon was beginning to fade into a darker gradient, the first hint of the evening flight's transition toward night. Adria's mind remained alert, every act from Clarice recorded, each one threaded into the same deliberate pattern. The removal of her meal tray before she had finished and the abrupt seatback push were still fresh in her mind, not because they had startled her into reaction, but because they had joined the long string of calculated acts that Clarice had executed with such deliberate timing. The curtain ahead still divided her from the forward section of first class. The torn magazine remained on the tray table like a planted insult, and her smaller bag was still out of reach near the back of the aircraft. She had not asked for it to be returned, not because she didn't want it, but because she refused to give Clarice the satisfaction of knowing it mattered enough to request. From the galley came the faint, rich aroma of chocolate, vanilla, and roasted coffee beans, mingling with the softer scents of warm pastries and freshly whipped cream. Dessert service had begun, and the cart rolled into view, polished silver trays glinting faintly under the cabin's warm light. Clarice moved behind it with her usual composed stride, every motion efficient, her voice soft but bright as she presented the options to each passenger. A slice of chocolate tort, a small fruit tart, a scoop of sorbet served in chilled glass. She described each offering with care, using the kind of detail that elevated the choices into an indulgent moment of the journey. Adria watched her progression down the aisle, noting the precision in her hand movements, the way she leaned slightly toward each seat, her eyes warm and engaged. Then Clarice reached her row. Her gaze slid past Adria without the smallest pause, her hands not slowing as she angled the cart toward the passenger behind her. The shift in direction was smooth enough to seem almost automatic, but to Adria it was unmistakable, a deliberate exclusion performed under the cover of efficiency. She neither flinched nor turned her head to follow the cart. Instead, she kept her eyes on the window, her reflection faint against the darkening blue of the sky outside. Behind her, a man accepted the chocolate tort with a grateful nod, the sound of fork against porcelain beginning seconds later. Across the aisle, the fruit tart was praised for its freshness. The aromas reached her without the taste, and she added another entry to her silent ledger. Clarice continued her route, the dessert cart eventually disappearing toward the galley again. Moments later, she reappeared, this time carrying a stainless steel carafe in one hand and a stack of fine porcelain cups in the other. The rich, roasted scent of fresh coffee spread quickly through the cabin, cutting through the softer notes of dessert. She moved from row to row, refilling cups, tilting her head slightly toward each passenger, her tone warm as she asked if they would like more. Each refill was a small gesture of care, the liquid poured in a smooth, uninterrupted stream, steam curling into the air before vanishing. When she reached Adria's seat, the rhythm faltered only in the sense that her arm did not extend. The carafe remained close to her body, her eyes already on the passenger to Adria's right as she stepped forward to offer them a refill. The motion was fluid, casual, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it, but to Adria it was as visible as a closed door. She did not reach for her empty cup, nor did she speak. Instead, she left it exactly where it was, centered neatly on the tray table beside the torn magazine, the absence of coffee as deliberate in its presentation as the omission had been in execution. Clarice moved past, offering coffee to the couple ahead, her voice light, the sound of pouring liquid marking each interaction. The carafe was lighter by the time she returned to the galley, yet not a single drop had been offered to Adria. Around her, the other passengers leaned back into their seats, some savoring dessert with coffee, others resting with cups cradled between their hands, the warmth a quiet comfort against the cooled cabin air. Adria's own hands remained still in her lap, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. She did not look toward the galley, nor toward Clarice as she passed again moments later. The quiet between them had become its own kind of statement, one that neither was willing to break with anything as trivial as words. Outside, the horizon was shifting toward a deeper shade of gold, the sun edging lower, casting a slant of light across the cabin that turned the brushed metal details into small, glowing lines. The atmosphere was one of ease for most, the kind of gentle luxury that made long flights feel shorter. For Audrey, it was a study in precision, the careful, targeted ways in which one person could attempt to diminish another without ever stepping outside the boundaries of professionalism. The dessert she had not been offered, the coffee that had bypassed her cup entirely, both settled alongside the memory of the meal removed too soon, the seatback pushed without warning, the blanket withheld, the towel skipped, the bag displaced. Each one small, but together they formed a pattern too exact to be chance. She let her eyes drift back to the torn magazine, the rip along its corner now catching the last of the direct sunlight through the window. The page beneath was creased, the image distorted, yet it lay perfectly still, unmoved since it had been placed there. Like her, it remained in place despite the attempt to present it as less than whole. Clarice's voice rose briefly in the forward cabin beyond the curtain, a soft laugh shared with another attendant, the sound fading as she moved farther away. Audrey's seat remained a pocket of stillness, her posture unchanged, her hands resting loosely in her lap while her mind kept its precise account of every omission and intrusion that had defined the hours since boarding. The dessert service she had been excluded from, the coffee that had passed her by, all joined the earlier disruptions, the missing towel, the spilled water, the downgraded meal, the absent blanket, the blocked view, the displaced bag, the sigh at the seatbelt check, the torn magazine, the prematurely removed lunch tray, the forced upright seat, each one a stitch in a deliberate design that Clarice had been weaving since the very start. Now the aisle was quiet again, only the faint murmurs of private conversations breaking the calm. Audrey's gaze had settled on the horizon outside her window, a band of deepening gold at the edge of the fading blue. Her mind registered the subtle shift of air before Clarice appeared, moving down the aisle with no cart, no visible purpose, her pace casual but not idle. She stopped at Audrey's row without a word, her hand reaching down to the small side table where a sealed bottle of water rested, placed there earlier by another attendant. The bottle's cap was smooth and unbroken, its label aligned perfectly, condensation still beating faintly on the clear plastic from the galley's cooler. Clarice picked it up with the same grace she used for any service motion, but in its place, she set down another bottle. This one lacking the chill, the label slightly wrinkled, the cap bearing the faint, uneven twist marks of having been opened before. The switch was seamless, her hand never lingering more than a second, but the change was obvious to Audrey. It was not a mistake of supply. There were no shortages here, not in first class. This was intentional. Clarice continued down the aisle, glancing once toward the curtain as if checking on something ahead, then disappearing briefly into the galley. Audrey didn't reach for the bottle. She let it sit, the imperfection of it standing out against the precision of the rest of her space, much as the torn magazine still lay on the tray. Both were small things, but both were meant to suggest a downgrade, a removal from the standard afforded to others. She leaned back slightly, her spine touching the cool leather of the seat, and let her focus drift to the rhythmic sway of the curtain with the plane's movement. Minutes later, Clarice reappeared, this time with her hands empty, her eyes scanning the seats as though searching for something to adjust. She stopped again at Audrey's row, leaning slightly toward the aisle seat across from her to offer a quick word to another passenger, then glanced at Audrey's seat without meeting her gaze. Her hand reached toward the lower side of the backrest, where the small lumbar pillow was tucked, hidden from view unless one was looking for it. With a smooth, practiced motion, she slid it free, her fingers curling around the soft cushion, as though it were simply another item in need of rearrangement. Without pause, she turned and stepped to the row ahead, where a man had been shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Clarice placed the pillow behind him, adjusting it with a light pat before straightening with a polite smile. The man murmured his thanks, oblivious to where the pillow had come from. Audrey's seat now lacked the gentle support that had been there since boarding, the absence subtle, but immediately felt in the change of posture it required. It wasn't the kind of discomfort that would draw sympathy from anyone watching. It was too minor, too invisible, but it was calculated to chip away at her ease. Clarice's expression never broke from its professional mask as she moved on, tending to other passengers with the same attentiveness she had withheld from Audrey all flight. The pillow's removal, like the water bottle's replacement, was not about necessity. It was about sending a message that her comfort was negotiable and subject to Clarice's quiet authority. Audrey adjusted her shoulders slightly, feeling the absence, but refusing to reach for any alternative. Her body might register the change, but her demeanor would not. Around her, the cabin returned to its calm rhythm. A soft chime signaled the change in cabin lighting to an even dimmer setting, preparing for the night portion of the flight. Some passengers settled under blankets. Others tilted their seats into deeper reclines. The scents from earlier, the coffee, the desserts, had faded into the background, replaced by the cleaner, cooler scent of circulating air. Audrey's gaze drifted once more to the bottle on her side table, its replaced cap catching the dim light in a dull, uneven reflection. She imagined Clarice's satisfaction at the thought of her taking a sip without noticing, of accepting something lesser without question. But she would not touch it. It would remain there untouched, the same way the torn magazine had a silent refusal to participate in Clarice's game. She could feel the tension in the space around her, a quiet standoff wrapped in the appearance of normalcy. Clarice moved past once more, her eyes sliding over Audrey without acknowledgement, her attention focused entirely on someone requesting an extra blanket. Every action she took seemed designed to remind Audrey of her control, yet the more deliberate they became, the more they accumulated into a visible pattern, at least to someone looking closely. Outside the window, the gold had faded to a muted orange, the horizon line sharpening as night approached. The cabin's warm light created small halos around the reading lamps still in use, the rest of the space falling into a comfortable dimness. Audrey remained still, her breathing even, her posture dignified despite the incremental removals of comfort. She didn't need the sealed water, the lumbar pillow, or the blanket from earlier to know that she belonged exactly where she was. What she needed was the record she was building in her mind, each act cataloged and preserved. The absence of the lumbar pillow pressed against Audrey's lower back in a way that was less about discomfort and more about awareness, a constant reminder of Clarice's hand in shaping her environment. The cabin's lighting had shifted further toward night mode now, the amber glow fading into softer, more diffused illumination meant to coax passengers into rest. Most had reclined into the darkness, their reading lamps forming small islands of light, casting narrow cones across books or tablets. Audrey had chosen to keep hers off, preferring the dim calm of the space, as the horizon outside dissolved into deep indigo. She was watching the faint curve of the earth against the last streaks of twilight when Clarice appeared again, this time without the brisk pace of service, but rather the slow, deliberate movement of someone about to insert herself into another space. She didn't pause to speak or even signal her intention. Instead, she reached across the narrow boundary of Audrey's seat, her arm passing directly in front of Audrey's face as she extended upward to the overhead panel. The scent of her perfume cut through the recycled air sharp and close, her sleeve brushing against the outer edge of Audrey's shoulder. Her hand found the button for the reading light and pressed it. The LED snapped on instantly, its beam aimed not at the table, but downward toward Audrey's eyes, white and unfiltered against the relative darkness. Audrey blinked against the sudden brightness, her vision momentarily blurred, the afterimage of the light burning against her retinas. Clarice didn't adjust the angle to soften it or offer an explanation. She simply stepped back, gave the smallest nod as if she had performed a neutral task, and moved on down the aisle. The beam remained, pooling across Audrey's lap and table, throwing the open cap of the water bottle into stark relief beside the jagged tear in the magazine's cover. Audrey didn't reach to turn it off. Leaving it on was its own form of refusal, the way one might refuse to brush away a small irritation if doing so would validate the intent behind it. Instead, she adjusted her position so that the light fell to the side of her vision, letting her gaze rest again on the dark outside the window. The low hum of the engines had become almost hypnotic when she finally decided to retrieve a folder from her carry-on, the one bag she had kept under the seat in front of her. She slid forward slightly, her hands reaching for the zipper. The cabin was quiet enough that the faint rasp of fabric opening seemed louder than it was. Her attention was on the folder when the movement came, a subtle shift of air followed by the unmistakable presence of someone passing close. Clarice brushed past her left shoulder, the contact featherlight but deliberate, the kind that didn't happen without intent in the spacious layout of first class. Adria's balance shifted reflexively, her torso turning slightly to avoid a full collision, and in that moment the reach for her folder became a second priority. Clarice's voice didn't rise, no apology was offered, no acknowledgement that she had forced Adria to shift at all. The narrow avoidance of physical contact was just enough to invade without overtly crossing a professional line, leaving the discomfort to settle in Adria's own muscles. Adria straightened again slowly, the folder in her hand, her movements unhurried as she replaced herself in the seat. Her eyes tracked Clarice's retreat down the aisle, the attendant pausing to adjust a blanket for another passenger, her manner warm and considerate there in a way it never was here. The beam of the overhead light still cut across Adria's space, more intrusive now than before, illuminating the edges of her blazer, the curve of her hands, the bottle, the magazine. The disruption had no practical purpose, no service was being rendered, no request was being met. It was, like every other act that had preceded it, a reminder of control over the physical boundaries of her comfort. Around her, the rest of the cabin moved in the slow rhythm of evening flight. A man softly turning pages in a hardcover book, a woman lowering her seat another inch into recline, the faint clink of ice in a glass 2 rows ahead. Adria's focus narrowed not to the light or the lingering awareness of the shoulder brush, but to the deepening structure of the pattern Clarice had been building. Each intrusion into her personal space had been incremental, enough to register without crossing into indisputable offense. This was the craft of it, the way the provocations could be explained away if challenged, the way they could be denied as coincidence. Adria knew better. She reached up then, not to turn the light off entirely, but to adjust its angle, redirecting the beam toward the empty seat beside her. The light no longer touched her directly, but she left it on, an act both of practical relief and subtle defiance. She opened the folder, flipping slowly through its contents, her focus only partially on the printed pages. The rest of her attention was on the muted activity in the galley ahead, the faint shadows moving beyond the curtain, and the knowledge that Clarice would return, as she always did. Outside, the last trace of the sun had vanished, leaving the wingtip light to flash against the darkness. Inside, the dimness was punctuated by isolated pools of artificial light, each passenger's chosen environment respected, except hers. The bottle with the twisted cap caught the edge of her vision again, and for a moment she considered moving it to the floor. She didn't. It stayed where it was, just like the magazine, both reminders of the flight's unspoken conflict. Clarice's shadow flickered briefly in the aisle light as she stepped forward to assist another passenger, her tone warm and patient. The contrast between those interactions and her own was so stark now that even without words, the narrative was clear. Adria closed the folder, set it neatly on the table, and rested her hands atop it, her posture as composed as it had been from the start. The faint memory of that unnecessary brush against her shoulder lingered like static under her skin, one more deliberate act in the growing lattice of slights and interruptions. The rest of the cabin had settled into the quiet lull of night flight, an almost sacred stillness that first-class passengers expected as the unspoken exchange for their fare. Reading lamps dotted the space like warm constellations, casting their light over novels and e-readers, while others had gone dark entirely, their occupants already drifting into sleep under neatly folded blankets. The air smelled faintly of brewed chamomile tea and the subtle sweetness of dessert crumbs still lingering from earlier service. Adria had allowed her posture to soften slightly, though she remained upright. The hum of the engines and the dimmed lighting created the perfect environment for rest, and though she wasn't ready to sleep deeply, she allowed her eyes to close for moments at a time, letting her breathing sink with the steady vibration of the plane. Her mind remained alert beneath the surface calm, the mental ledger of Clarice's targeted acts still active. But her body was willing to take these brief pockets of reprieve. It was during one such moment, her head tilted slightly toward the window, eyes half closed, that the first metallic sound came. A sharp click overhead, followed by the muted thud of a compartment door being shut. The sound was common enough in boarding or disembarkation, but here, at this hour, it carried a jarring weight against the surrounding quiet. Audrey opened her eyes slowly, glancing upward to see Clarice standing directly above her seat, her hands resting on the edge of the overhead bin. Without looking down to meet her gaze, Clarice opened the bin again, the latch releasing with another distinct mechanical pop. She pretended to adjust the contents inside, her movements slow, deliberate, each shift of a bag accompanied by the rustle of fabric and the faint creak of the compartment hinges. Then came the closure, firm, precise, the latch snapping shut with a sound that cut through the ambient hum. Clarice stepped back as if to move on, then paused, her hand returning to the latch as though she'd just remembered something. Another click, another thud. Audrey watched her work without expression, noting the way her timing was spaced just far enough apart to interrupt the process of relaxation. It wasn't rapid, like someone rushing to finish a task. It was measured, intentional, each movement leaving a ripple in the calm before the next one came. Clarice adjusted the same bag twice, then stepped back and shut the compartment once more, the sound landing in the air like a punctuation mark. She moved a few steps down the aisle, tending briefly to another passenger's request, then circled back toward Audrey's row as if the bin above her needed further attention. The latch released again, the panel swinging upward with a faint hiss of displaced air. Clarice's fingers brushed the edge of a folded jacket inside, shifting it no more than an inch before lowering the door. This time, the closure was slower, but no less deliberate, the latch clicking into place with the same sharp finality. Audrey could feel the rhythm of it now, the cycle of her body easing toward rest only to be pulled back by the sound directly above her head. It wasn't loud enough to disturb the entire cabin, but it was perfectly positioned to keep her from slipping into the stillness the others enjoyed. The tactic was familiar in its intent: deny her rest, not through overt disturbance, but through the persistent needle of minor interruption. She leaned her head back again, eyes half-lidded, refusing to turn away or give Clarice the visible satisfaction of reaction. Another click, another thud. This time, when Clarice opened the compartment, she adjusted a strap on a bag that clearly wasn't in danger of shifting, the action so unnecessary that its purpose couldn't be mistaken. She closed it once more, then lingered for a beat before moving on down the aisle with her usual measured pace. Audrey exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled. Her mind filed the act away beside the others, part of the same pattern of eroded boundaries and manufactured inconvenience. Around her, passengers continued to rest undisturbed, their faces softened in sleep, their space respected. The couple across the aisle had reclined fully, their reading lamp off, the faint sound of slow, even breathing signaling complete relaxation. Audrey's space, by contrast, was an island of disruption. She glanced toward the closed curtain ahead, the barrier that still divided her from the forward section, then back to the darkened window beside her. The faint glow from the wingtip light strobed against the clouds, a reminder that time and distance were still moving forward, even if her own moments here felt caught in a loop of provocation. Clarice's shadow passed through the aisle again, this time without stopping, but Audrey knew the reprieve wouldn't last long. The pattern had been too consistent, too intentional, for this to be anything but a temporary pause. The bottle with the twisted cap still sat untouched on the table, its presence as fixed as the torn magazine beside it, both artifacts of earlier manipulations. The absence of a lumbar pillow made itself known again as she adjusted her posture, the subtle strain in her back a quiet reminder of what had been taken. Another click broke the thought. Audrey didn't even look up this time. She knew the source. Clarice had returned, the latch above her head releasing again, the compartment swinging open. She reached inside with exaggerated care, as though the contents required her constant supervision, then shut it once more with the same sharp finality. The act had no practical reason. It was pure theater, an assertion that she could control even the airspace above Audria's head. Audria's gaze stayed on the window, her expression unshaken, the faint reflection of her own face a calm counterpoint to the petty storm Clarice was trying to sustain. The sound of the latch might have punctuated the air, but it didn't puncture her resolve. She had been in far more hostile spaces than this, and she knew that endurance wasn't passive. It was the act of holding still while someone else tried to move you. The bottle with the twisted cap, the torn magazine, the absent lumbar pillow, the overhead light angled at her eyes, the brush of Clarice's shoulder, the skipped dessert, the stolen blanket. Each one was part of the same deliberate current flowing beneath the surface of an otherwise quiet flight. Outside her window, the night had deepened into an endless stretch of black, broken only by the wingtip light's steady flash and the occasional silver thread of moonlit cloud. Inside, the cabin lights were dimmed low, passengers asleep underneath layers of airline blankets, their heads resting against plush headrests or on pillows. Audria sat upright, her breathing even, her mind clear. She had grown used to being hyper-aware of her surroundings in spaces where power dynamics tilted against her, and here that awareness felt sharpened to a point. The stillness was broken not by noise this time, but by movement, small, deliberate movement above her head. Clarice had returned to the aisle, her posture as composed as ever, her steps silent against the carpet. She stopped at Audria's row without addressing her and unlatched the overhead compartment again. This time, her hands didn't touch the bin directly above Audria's seat for long. Instead, she reached in and lifted Audria's handbag with both hands, cradling it in a way that seemed overly careful for something she had no business moving. The bag was structured and compact, its zipper closed when Audria had last seen it, the leather smooth and dark under the soft cabin light. Without a glance downward, Clarice stepped across the aisle and placed it in the empty seat next to a sleeping passenger. She set it at an angle that left the top partially unzipped, the gleam of a metal zipper tooth catching the low light. From where Audria sat, the open gap looked just wide enough to suggest that someone had been rummaging or that the owner had left it neglected. The placement was casual enough to pass, as a simple oversight to the untrained eye, but Audria knew better. The gesture wasn't about storage efficiency. It was about control over her personal belongings, about creating an image of carelessness that wasn't hers. Clarice adjusted the strap so it dangled slightly over the seat's armrest, the bag resting there like a misplaced item awaiting a claim. Then she moved on without a word, the act folded seamlessly into the rhythm of her duties. Audria's gaze stayed locked on the bag for a long moment. She could feel the pull in her instincts to retrieve it immediately, to close the zipper and return it to her own domain, but she resisted the impulse. Moving too quickly would be a concession, a visible sign that the tactic had provoked her. Instead, she let it sit there, the way she had left the torn magazine on the tray and the twisted cap bottle untouched, visible evidence of the choices being made around her. The sleeping passenger beside the bag shifted slightly, their blanket slipping a little over one shoulder. The bag remained in place, the small open gap like a silent accusation. Audria adjusted her own position, turning slightly so she could watch it from the corner of her eye while keeping her posture relaxed. The hum of the engines filled the space between them, punctuated by the occasional chime from the cockpit. Clarice returned down the aisle minutes later, stopping briefly to check on a passenger's water glass before glancing, just for a fraction of a second, toward the seat across the aisle where the bag still rested. She didn't touch it this time, but the flicker of satisfaction in her expression was there and gone in less than a breath. Audria's mind cataloged it instantly. The cabin remained dim and calm, the only movement now coming from an attendant at the far end, checking the galley supplies. The contrast between the calm and the underlying game being played was almost stark enough to hum in the air. Audria finally moved, not abruptly, but with deliberate ease. She unfastened her seatbelt, stood, and stepped into the aisle, her movements smooth and unhurried. Crossing to the seat where her bag sat, she reached down, adjusted the strap so it no longer dangled, and closed the zipper with a quiet, measured pull. Her fingers brushed the smooth leather for a fraction of a second, an unspoken reclaiming of what was hers, before she lifted it and returned to her seat. She placed the bag under the seat in front of her, the position it had occupied before Clarice's interference, her hands resting on her knees as she sat back again. There was no glance toward Clarice, no outward sign of tension, only the quiet act of restoration. The curtain ahead swayed faintly with the plane's movement, the faint shadows of crew activity barely visible beyond. Audrey could still feel the space where her pillow should have been, the mild strain in her lower back a constant reminder. But the bag's return to her control was a small anchor against the slow erosion Clarice was orchestrating. Minutes later, Clarice passed again, her eyes sweeping the aisle, catching the bag's restored position, and sliding away without acknowledgement. The faintest shift in her jaw suggested that the moment had not gone as she had intended. Audrey's expression didn't change. She looked out the window, the reflection of her own face ghosted over the wing and the starlit sky beyond. The wingtip light flashed in steady rhythm, the endless darkness beneath them stretching out like an unbroken sheet. The cabin's warmth pressed in gently, the quiet conversations at the far end muted to the point of vanishing. Yet beneath the peace, Audrey could feel the undercurrent still running, the knowledge that every small incursion Clarice made was building toward something larger, even if Clarice herself hadn't yet realized that the pattern was becoming more visible than she intended. The handbag incident wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about intrusion into the sphere of personal security, about planting doubt in how others might perceive her. Audrey had spent too long in spaces where perception could be weaponized not to recognize the tactic instantly. She took a slow sip from her untouched glass of water, the one that hadn't been swapped, then set it back down beside the twisted cap bottle. The two sat there together like mismatched sentinels, small symbols of the boundary between what she would accept and what she would not. The torn magazine still lay on the tray, its curl more pronounced now, a silent testament to how long it had been ignored. The moment of retrieval had been executed without a word, without a glance toward the woman who had moved it, but it had carried its own quiet finality. Still, Audrey knew this was not an end. Clarice had not exhausted her methods. The cabin remained dim and still, the hush of night flight wrapping around the rows of passengers like an insulating blanket. Those asleep seemed entirely removed from the intricate undercurrent of tension playing out in the aisle. Clarice, however, moved through that stillness like a shadow that could decide at will where the light would falter. Audrey sat upright, one hand resting lightly on the folder she had retrieved earlier. Her gaze settled on the window where the wingtip light pulsed against the blackness. Her peripheral vision caught the shift in Clarice's movement as she re-entered the aisle from the galley, her hands empty, her stride unhurried but purposeful. She paused 2 rows ahead, adjusted a passenger's blanket, then took a small step sideways into Audrey's space without making eye contact. From the fold of her uniform, Clarice produced a crumpled white napkin, creased sharply in multiple places, the faint stain of something brown along one edge, and let it drop with casual precision onto the carpet at the outer edge of Audrey's foot space. The napkin landed askew, half folded over itself, positioned close enough to her seat that it could easily be assumed to have fallen from her tray or hands. Clarice didn't linger. She moved on as if nothing had happened, continuing her slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. The napkin remained, its presence an almost invisible accusation, waiting for someone else to notice it. Audrey didn't look down at it directly. She kept her posture straight, her hands folded on the folder, her breathing steady. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, the first impulse, to remove the planted evidence, was the very thing that completed the trap. Instead, she let it sit there, an object in the corner of her vision, knowing Clarice's plan required it to be seen before it was moved. The minutes stretched with only the quiet symphony of a long-haul flight to mark their passing. The hum of the engines, the occasional click of a seatbelt being unfastened, the soft murmur of voices from the galley. Then, as though on cue, Clarice returned. But this time she was not alone. A second attendant accompanied her, a younger woman with an open, professional smile, clearly unaware of the web being woven here. Clarice leaned toward her slightly, her tone carrying just enough to breach the personal bubbles of the nearby passengers. "There's a mess near this seat," she said, gesturing vaguely toward Adria's space. "Could you take care of it?" The words were soft enough to avoid being called loud, but sharp enough to reach the ears of the couple across the aisle, whose eyes flickered momentarily toward Adria's feet. The younger attendant gave a polite nod, stepping forward with a small tray in hand. She bent to retrieve the napkin, her motion efficient and without suspicion, but the damage had already been done. The image was planted, the implication that Adria had let her space fall into untidiness, that she had been careless with the pristine environment expected here. Adria kept her expression neutral, her eyes resting on the dark horizon outside, her body language offering no acknowledgement of the act. The younger attendant straightened with the napkin on her tray, gave a polite smile toward the row, and disappeared back toward the galley. Clarice lingered a second longer, her gaze sliding over Adria without settling. Then she, too, moved on. The cabin swallowed the moment quickly, the hum of the engines smoothing over the ripples of quiet judgment that Clarice had tried to stir. Adria's mind recorded the details with precision. The drop of the napkin, the timed return with a witness, the volume calibrated to reach only the nearby passengers. This was not about cleanliness. It was about optics, about crafting an unspoken narrative that she was careless, out of place in the curated neatness of this space. Across the aisle, the couple had returned to their conversation, their glances toward her already fading. Yet Adria knew that moments like this had a way of leaving residue, subtle impressions that could be drawn upon later if someone chose to reinforce them. She shifted slightly in her seat, the movement calm, measured, her hands now resting on her lap. The torn magazine still sat untouched on the tray table, the twisted cap bottle beside it, each one a quiet reminder of the earlier acts. The crumpled napkin was gone, but the intention behind it lingered like the faint scent of perfume after someone has walked away. Clarice's shadow appeared once more at the far end of the cabin, her back turned as she spoke to another passenger, her gestures animated, her posture relaxed. It was the posture of someone who believed her small edits to reality were going unnoticed, who trusted that her authority over this environment could shape the perceptions of anyone within it. Adria didn't need to disrupt that belief, not yet. Letting her think the stage was hers to control was part of the longer game. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, the only break in its expanse the distant glint of another aircraft passing miles away. Inside, the rows remained still, the air temperature dropping just slightly as the flight edged further into the night. Adria breathed evenly, her heartbeat steady. The moment with the napkin would pass for most as nothing more than an insignificant cleanup, but she had lived too long in spaces where the smallest cues could shape the largest judgments to dismiss it. This was a move, and moves meant momentum, whether the other player realized it or not. She reached for the folder again, opening it not because she intended to read, but because it gave her hands purpose, an appearance of engagement that could not be mistaken for withdrawal. The crumpled white paper was gone, disposed of without fanfare by the younger attendant, yet the memory of Clarice's voice carrying just enough to reach the ears across the aisle still hung faintly in the air. The couple opposite had returned to their hushed conversation, the soft clink of glassware punctuating their words, but Adria had caught the fleeting glances they'd cast earlier, and she knew Clarice had intended exactly that. Now, with the cabin lights dimmed to their lowest setting and most passengers settled into recline, Clarice moved again with the kind of quiet authority that drew no attention to itself unless one was already watching closely. She began in the row ahead of Adria, leaning slightly toward the older man seated there. Her tone was low enough to pass as casual, but her gestures carried a certain persuasive rhythm. Within a minute, the man had unbuckled his belt, gathered his tablet and water glass, and followed Clarice toward the section behind, where she indicated a seat with an open smile. She returned almost immediately, her pace unhurried, pausing at the couple across from Adria. Again, there was that low, measured voice, something about more space, perhaps, or a quieter area toward the rear. The couple exchanged a look, their expressions neither unhappy nor eager, simply pliant under the suggestion. They began to collect their belongings, folding their blankets and stacking their books. Clarice assisted with the smallest touches, handing the woman her jacket with a graceful smile before guiding them to new seats out of Audria's line of sight. Within the span of 10 minutes, the once occupied seats around her had been vacated. The empty space was sudden, almost surgical in its precision. In a cabin where premium seating was a prized commodity, such vacancies would look deliberate, intentional, as though someone had decided these seats should remain free. Clarice returned to the now cleared area, her movements composed, her hands smoothing the armrests and adjusting the reclines of the unoccupied chairs. She placed fresh pillows at each one, aligning them with the center of the headrests, and laid folded blankets neatly at the foot of each seat, untouched and pristine. The result was visually striking. Audria in her seat, alone in the middle of a neatly prepared pocket of emptiness, the kind of arrangement that suggested separation by design. To the casual observer passing through, it would appear as though these seats were being held for someone of significance, or worse, that Audria's isolation was self-selected, a choice born of aloofness or discomfort with proximity. The message, subtle as it was, played directly into the silent social currents of spaces like this, the optics of being apart. Audria's gaze shifted briefly from the window to the newly vacant seats. She noted the symmetry of Clarice's adjustments, the deliberate way she'd made them appear untouched by any passenger. It was theater, staged under the cover of service, and like all good theater, it relied on the audience, believing the set was natural. She could feel the faint stir of movement from behind, passengers noticing the arrangement as they passed through to the lavatory, their eyes flicking toward her row before quickly away. Each glance was an unspoken question. Why was she alone here? Audria didn't shift, didn't let her posture change in acknowledgement. Her breathing remained slow and even, her gaze returning to the darkness outside where the wingtip light kept its steady rhythm. She had no intention of moving, and she had no need to fill the empty space beside her. The emptiness itself was now part of the pattern she was tracing in her mind. Clarice reappeared moments later, this time without stopping, her path taking her toward the galley with the same smooth precision she'd shown all evening. But as she passed, her eyes flicked briefly over the row, just enough to take in the effect of her handiwork. The faint curve of her lips, not quite a smile, was there and gone before anyone else could notice. Audria let her own face remain perfectly neutral, but inside she marked the move for exactly what it was, an attempt to shape how others in the cabin perceived her, to craft a visual isolation that could feed whispers or assumptions later. The hum of the engines pressed in, constant and grounding, even as the air in the cleared space felt subtly different, less softened by the presence of other bodies. The scent of Clarice's perfume still lingered faintly from her earlier pass, blending with the cooler, filtered air circulating through the vents above. From behind, the faint rustle of movement suggested that some of the relocated passengers were settling into their new places, their voices low, their laughter muffled by distance. Audria's attention remained outwardly on the night sky, but she could sense the change in how the cabin felt around her, the absence of small sounds and shared space that had been present only minutes ago. She knew that for some, isolation could be interpreted as privilege, but in this context, crafted by Clarice's hand, it was meant as exclusion. This was not the generous privacy of a celebrity shielded from fans. It was the deliberate removal of company, dressed in the language of hospitality. Clarice's skill lay in making it seem effortless, as though the shifts were passenger-driven, mere happenstance. The truth, however, was as clear as the smooth arrangement of those untouched pillows. Every detail had been curated to produce a specific impression. Audria considered the stage now set around her. In Clarice's mind, perhaps, it was a silent victory, Audria alone, framed by empty seats, made to appear apart from the rest. But Audria knew that space could also be a shield, and in the ledger she kept in her mind, this move was simply another entry, another moment that would add weight to the reckoning Clarice could not yet see coming. The isolation was not silent. It spoke in the language of absence, in the unasked questions from passing passengers whose eyes lingered just a moment too long before sliding away. Adria sat within it as if it were an intentional choice, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. But her mind never left the slow accumulation of each move Clarice had made. She could still recall the precise tone of Clarice's voice when she had lured the surrounding passengers to other seats. Warm, persuasive, dipped in professional courtesy. Now, with her tableau of isolation established, Clarice was ready to plant the next seed, one that would grow in the shadows of passenger conversation. It began when Clarice reappeared from the far end of the cabin, walking toward the galley with that same unhurried stride that gave her actions the veneer of normalcy. She passed Adria's row without looking directly at her, the faint scent of her perfume drifting in the cooled air, and disappeared through the partially drawn curtain at the galley entrance. The murmur of voices from within was faint, but distinct to someone trained to listen between the steady engine hum. Clarice's voice carried just enough weight to separate itself from the background noise. The modulation low, intimate, meant for a single recipient, but crafted to be overheard by no one except its target listener. A passenger stood near the coffee station inside, a middle-aged man with a tailored blazer, the type who carried himself as though even mid-flight he was still in control of a boardroom. His body language was relaxed, one hand wrapped loosely around a ceramic cup as he chatted casually with Clarice. At a moment when his attention drifted briefly toward the aisle, Clarice tilted her head slightly, as if confiding something too sensitive for the open cabin. Her words were muted, but her eyes gave away the subject as they flicked toward the curtain, toward the row where Adria sat alone. The flicker was brief but deliberate, the kind of nonverbal cue that could load even the most innocuous sentence with pointed meaning. The man's expression shifted subtly, an eyebrow raised in faint curiosity, his lips curving in something that wasn't quite a smile. Whatever Clarice had said was enough to plant the seed, a suggestion, perhaps, that Adria had been uncooperative, that she was the reason for the surrounding emptiness, that her presence in first class was marked by trouble rather than merit. Clarice's face remained neutral, professional even, but her body language carried a trace of satisfaction. She handed the man a napkin with his coffee and stepped back, giving him space to return to his seat. He passed through the curtain and down the aisle toward his row, and as he approached the area where Adria sat, his eyes glanced toward her, not long, not lingering, but with a specific kind of curiosity that only comes from having heard something that begs for quiet observation. He took his seat 2 rows ahead, placing his coffee on the armrest, but every so often his gaze shifted back, subtle and quick, as though trying to match the whispered portrait with the reality in front of him. Adria felt those glances the way one feels a change in air pressure, without needing to look up to confirm. She didn't alter her posture, didn't offer any reaction that might feed the narrative being shaped in the man's mind. Instead, she kept her gaze on the window, her reflection a faint silhouette against the black sky beyond. The wingtip light continued its steady pulse, a metronome against the silence. Clarice emerged from the galley a minute later, her expression composed, carrying a tray with 2 bottles of sparkling water. She moved past Adria without pause, delivering them to another passenger further back, her performance seamless. To anyone not tracking her movements, it would appear she had simply gone to fulfill a request. But Adria had followed enough of her patterns to know that the whispered exchange in the galley was no random interaction. This was escalation by implication, the crafting of a reputation within the closed ecosystem of the cabin. Here, in this compressed world miles above the Earth, stories spread not by volume, but by precision. A raised eyebrow, a shared look, a murmur framed by context. That was enough to shape how one passenger saw another. And if the right passengers heard it, the impression could ripple quietly outward, becoming part of the collective perception of the flight without anyone being able to point to a single provable moment of malice. The man with the blazer took another glance over his shoulder, quickly enough that it could have been accidental. But this time the corner of his mouth twitched in something between amusement and skepticism. It was the look of someone weighing what they'd been told against what they could see. Adria met his glance for the briefest moment, not confrontationally, but with a steady calm that allowed no opening for the kind of silent judgment Clarice might have been hoping to inspire. He looked away first, focusing again on his coffee, But the moment had already been noted. Clarice didn't linger in her section after returning from the back. She passed through twice more, each time avoiding direct interaction with Audrea, but ensuring she moved within the line of sight of her newly recruited observer. It was a choreography of subtle reinforcement, the repeated visual of Audrea sitting alone, framed by vacant seats. The subtext Clarice had whispered now supported by the visual she had so carefully staged earlier. Audrea let the silence sit, understanding that to react here, in this confined theater, would only lend credence to the narrative. The truth was, silence was often more dangerous to an opponent like Clarice than outright defiance. It left them without the clear emotional reaction they needed to justify their fiction. Outside, the vast dark stretched unbroken, no moon to soften it, the stars faint against the high-altitude haze. Inside, the temperature had cooled another degree, the soft blanket over Audrea's lap holding the warmth in. The emptiness around her felt almost tactical now, less like exile and more like a vantage point. She could see the cabin's movements clearly. The way conversations shifted in tone as Clarice passed, the way passengers' eyes tracked her with a casual attention given to someone they either trusted or feared. Every gesture of hers was calculated to appear harmless, every interaction designed to feed into the private impressions she had planted. The plane had begun its slow descent, the pitch of the engines shifting, the subtle change in pressure pressing faintly against the ears of every passenger. The cabin lights brightened slightly, just enough to signal the transition from the cloaked anonymity of night flight to the return of full visibility. Audrea remained seated in 3B, her seatbelt fastened, the isolation around her row unchanged from Clarice's earlier orchestration. The neatly staged empty seats still framed her, the fresh pillows untouched, the blankets folded like waiting props. Clarice moved through the aisle one final time before landing, collecting stray glasses and checking that trays were stowed. Her demeanor was as polished as ever, her steps even, her smile measured for each passenger, though her gaze skipped Audrea's row as it always had, as though by omission she could erase her from the narrative she'd been shaping all night. The air in the cabin had shifted subtly. Conversations were quieter, glances quicker. The man in the blazer had stopped looking back, though Audrea could still feel that he was thinking about her in the context of what he'd been told. The couple who had been moved earlier walked past to use the lavatory, their eyes grazing over her, without expression, but holding just a fraction longer than politeness required. The curtain to the galley swayed once as the captain's voice came over the intercom, clear, warm, and carrying the practiced confidence of someone who understood the subtle art of shaping a cabin's mood. Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for our final approach, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone on board who is joining our airline family in a very special way tonight. There was a slight pause, the kind that drew every passenger's attention. We are honored to have seated in 3B one of our newest major investors, Ms. Audrea Holloway. A ripple passed through the cabin like the shift of wind across tall grass. Heads turned, some subtly, others openly. The man in the blazer turned fully now, his expression sharpening with the realization of just how far from the truth Clarice's earlier implication had been. The couple who had been moved earlier exchanged quick glances, their faces registering that this was not a passenger to be nudged aside or framed with suspicion. Even those who had been too absorbed in their own travel to notice the night's undercurrents now looked toward her with fresh interest. Audrea inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the captain's words with a calm that neither invited conversation nor deflected it. She kept her posture straight, her expression poised, every movement underscoring the grace she had maintained throughout Clarice's slow campaign of pettiness. Clarice herself had frozen mid-step at the announcement, the tray in her hands momentarily still. The muscles in her jaw tightened before her professional mask reassembled itself, but the shift was visible to anyone who had been watching closely. She approached Audrea's row now, a faint, hurried brightness in her smile that had not been there all evening, her tone softening as she offered to collect anything Audrea wished to discard. Audrea met her eyes for the first time in hours, her gaze steady but not hostile, just a quiet, unflinching acknowledgement that she had seen every move, every choice. No words passed between them, But the silence carried its own weight. Around them, the surrounding passengers had begun to assemble the pieces in their minds. The isolation, the subtle slights, the planted impressions. Even those without the full picture could now see the dissonance between Clarice's sudden warmth and whatever had preceded it. That was the nature of confined spaces. Perceptions, once shifted, could not be unshifted. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Clarice retreated to her jump seat, her gaze flicking forward but never settling fully on Audrey again. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane tilted toward its final descent, the view outside shifting from black sky to scattered clusters of city lights. Audrey rested her hands on the folder in her lap, feeling the faint vibration of the aircraft as the landing gear deployed. She knew there would be no formal confrontation here, no scene. There didn't need to be. The real consequences in spaces like this rarely came from direct punishment. They came from the slow, silent shifting of perception, the way a name or a face was remembered in the minds of those who had witnessed something they could not unsee. As the plane touched down and began its taxi, the atmosphere in the cabin carried an unspoken recalibration. Passengers who had earlier accepted Clarice's cues without question now held them up against the captain's announcement and found the fit awkward. They would not say it aloud, but the next time they encountered someone in Clarice's uniform, they might remember the dissonance, the gap between service and intent. Audrey waited until the seatbelt sign clicked off before standing, moving with the same calm precision she had maintained all night. She collected her handbag from beneath the seat, zipper still closed, and stepped into the aisle. A few passengers offered polite nods or brief greetings as she passed. Others simply watched. Clarice remained at her post, her voice smooth as she wished each passenger a pleasant evening. But her eyes did not linger on Audrey. When Audrey stepped through the aircraft door into the bright, open space of the jet bridge, the air felt warmer, freer, uncompressed. Behind her, the cabin door closed, sealing Clarice inside with the weight of a night's performance, now reframed in the minds of those who had seen it. And somewhere in that sealed space, Audrey knew the balance of judgment had shifted, not in whispered galley conversations, but in the quiet consensus of witness. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think about how the plot unfolded. Was the ending satisfying? Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always great to see how far these stories travel.